All the second stage tanks now pressurized. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Like a furry torpedo to the jugular. This is Honey Badger Radio. Radio with Buddy.
Fathers involved in their kids' lives? Like, regularly?
Frequently? Why, this is an outrage. This is misogynistic. This is
in the best interest of the child, actually. And for that matter, all of society. Moms are great. If we don't already know that, women's advocates and female-focused media are happy to tell us. And just in case we forget, they remind us a lot. Which is fine. We're not gonna forget, but the moms here at Honey Badger Radio don't mind hearing from the peanut gallery how great we are. Dads are great too. However, the absence of media messages reminding the public of Dad's greatness is astounding. It often seems like just about the only time we ever see or hear how great dads are is when one of them gets killed. It's a real shame because the message, rare as it's given, seems to be lost on legislators, family court judges, and worst of all, far too many moms. They might be familiar with the sentiments laid out in the tender years doctrine, used in courts for decades as a standard based on which it was deemed okay to separate young kids from their fathers during divorce to ensure more time with their mothers. In reality, as Charles Lewis and Michael E. Lamb pointed out in their report, Father's Influence on Children's Development, the Evidence from Two-Parent Families, both parents' influence on their children is equally important, though their styles of interaction may be different. As we pointed out in the last show, the benefits of involved fathers are known to begin in infancy, with greater cognitive development by 6 months. Very young children of involved fathers score higher on the Bayley scales of infant and toddler development, a series of tests which measure the cognitive, language, and motor development of infants and toddlers compared with the norms taken from typically developing children of their age. While a mother's influence may be the child's first experience of comfort and security, playtime with dad may be his opportunity to more vigorously test his strength, coordination, and reflexes. The language difference may even be in the difference between mom's baby talk, which is often high-pitched and full of the kind of broken syllables you would expect to hear from a baby, and dad's baby talk, which is often nearly the same as he would speak to an adult, except for a more gentle, patient tone. Dad's toughness mitigates mom's tendency toward overprotectiveness, just as mom's caution mitigates dad's eagerness to see his kids test and expand their limits. Dad's calm approach to discovery learning, even when it comes with a few bumps and bruises, leads to toddlers who are better problem solvers and higher IQ preschoolers. With Dad, a child learns to evaluate a situation, take risks to achieve a goal, and if things don't go the way he wanted, to get up off the ground, brush himself off, reevaluate, and try again. This learned initiative and tenacity will serve him in school with a likelihood of better grades and better quantitative and verbal skills. At every turn, there is yet another benefit to involved fathers. Research demonstrates that the higher IQ result continues throughout childhood, as do the benefits to social development and performance in areas of responsibility like academic efforts and later, one's job. Overall, kids of involved fathers demonstrate greater cognizance, judgment, confidence, proficiency, and conduct. Mothers also benefit from father involvement. There is the obvious. We all want the best for our children. We want to see them succeed socially, academically, and professionally, to have the happiest lives possible, and to be loved and respected by others. This is a goal for mothers, one that a dedicated, involved father will arguably help to achieve. Cooperative co-parenting means neither parent is on their own. Mothers of children with involved fathers have a partner in decision-making, in striving to meet their children's needs, in caregiving, and in disciplinary rule enforcement. Even when parents aren't in a committed relationship, working together on these areas can make each parent's job easier. Cooperating on a schedule of caregiving can, even in separate homes, reduce or eliminate childcare costs. Fathers who are not hindered from involvement with their kids are more likely to be willing to pay child support than fathers who are alienated from their kids. Not only are they better able to see when there is a need, they're also better able to see their support's benefit to the kids. Fathers also benefit from their relationships with their children, just as mothers do. And this is not just taking into consideration the pain of having a familial relationship wrongly severed. Parents are aware of their importance to their children. This does not just convey a sense of obligation and responsibility, but of one's value, the fact that one matters. While it can be daunting, it is also a healthy boost to one's self-image, knowing that one has that importance. It also provides the benefit of inspiring a will to succeed, and a deeper, yet more choosy attitude toward risk-taking, narrowing the margins of what one may deem worth it. While fathers will risk their lives for their families, they will also preserve and reserve their lives for their families. The result? Greater marital stability, greater satisfaction and success in the workplace, fewer accidental and premature deaths, less substance abuse, less conflict with the law, less depression, greater life satisfaction, and overall, a longer life. Society would do well to re-examine its approach to father-child relationships. Each of these individual benefits adds up to a boon for the communities in which we live. More successful students, a better workforce, happier and more stable families, less crime, less poverty, less loss to the community from poor health or accidents, and as a result, greater tax revenue with less reason to spend it on micromanaging the public. The more information becomes available, the more obvious it is how counterintuitive it is to separate fathers from their kids. In fact, it would be more rational for our society, especially its leadership, to do everything possible to facilitate family unity, and barring that, cooperation between parents. Dads are great, and Uncle Sam is no substitute. Hello, and welcome to HBR Talk 44. For real this time, as unlike last time when I had mislabeled HBR Talk 43. It's okay to be dad. I'm your host, Hannah Wallen, here with the lovely and intelligent Anna Cherry and the professor of perspicacity, Aydin Paladin, to continue our talk about the importance of father involvement in a child's life. This conversation is a follow-up to our previous discussions about the separation of American kids from their parents that we've had over the last several shows. But before we get into today's topic, the usual reminders are in order. If you're on YouTube and it starts experiencing platform malfunction syndrome, which I'm given to understand it already has today, and it won't let you listen, we're also on Twitch, which I have been told is working well. And we're also on Facebook, because you can't keep a good badger down. If you want to be sure you'll always be able to catch our live streams, even if YouTube decides to throw us in the gulag for wrongthink, and I believe one of our channels is in there again. Or if you want to catch our show in its audio format, remember to go to badgerfeed.com and register to receive notifications. I also want to remind everyone, like I said last week, this isn't an indictment of mothers. It's about kids and their dads, and it's important to have this discussion. This is one of those instances where we're going to be dealing with some tough issues, so hold on to your outrage. Remember that what we are talking about is that kids need both parents, that is the ideal situation, and we recognize that the ideal situation isn't feasible for everybody, but it is still what society should strive for. So, please keep head, hands, and feet inside the vehicle at all times, and thank you for flying Air Badger. And with that, I'm going to toss the mic over to my co-hosts and have at it.
Yeah, I guess the first thing to say is just to reiterate what you said, and it's interesting. One of the studies that you sent to us this evening, which is Lewis and Lamb, 2003, Father's Influences on Children's Development, Evidence from Two-Parent Families, is very illustrative of what you were just saying there, in terms of, we're of course never indicating that one parent is superior to the other, correct? But some of this is very interesting in terms of how the sort of social aspect potentially of children, it seems to be, at least from some of the overview I'm seeing in this study, having just read it here fairly quickly, admittedly, that there seems to be a lot of the social aspect of children is potentially not dependent, but involved in their interaction with their fathers. Now, what's interesting to that is that we see so many children, particularly in the last 20 years, 30 years, as we also see parental, particularly father involvement in children go down, given the very feminist-oriented nature of the legislation, that we also have a rise in ADD, ADHD, and autism. Now, part of that is greater understanding of these diseases, but it's also possible, I would suggest, that given what I'm seeing here, that some of the social development is not happening particularly during the infantile and toddler years if we have absentee fathers. So it might be something that we haven't even thought of before, that we talk about the increase in autism and things like that, of also potentially being an effect of lower paternal involvement.
Well, I'd like to break in there for a sec, which is, I mean, admittedly, you can have an issue that, as we mentioned in the last stream, it's nature and nurture is about 50-50. You have a certain set of genetics or a certain development in the womb that happens, such as they've traced homosexuality, in fact, to the release of cortisol in a mother's womb in the 3rd trimester. And autism is seemingly very strongly associated, or at least now there's research coming out, that the maternal immune system and the way it, and the microbiome that the mother has actually affects the likelihood of a child having autism. And in fact, specifically microbiome of the gut is heavily implicated in autism of both children that are autistic and of course mothers in utero, etc. So I will say that there is very actual, like, biological immune system, gut bacteria related.
Right, of course.
What is it? Milk, such as breastfeeding. That also, once again, has to do with the immune system and the gut bacteria that the mother passes on. So to me, there's a huge correlation as far as research is concerned in that. However, what you're saying actually does make sense as well, of course, on top of that, because you can have a particular genetic or hereditary or circumstantial makeup in your genes and your biology, but then the environment in which you are raised in after that can significantly modulate that one direction or another. And if there is lack of socialization and things like that, that can definitely add to it. And it's interesting, though, that it is sort of the more feminine, maternal side of the force of the female and masculine is to be social, is to communicate, all of those things that autistic children are notoriously bad at. In fact, the man who invented or discovered, I should say, Asperger's, Hans Asperger, called autism the extreme malification of the brain. And so I would say that it is more a mother's role when it comes to communication and helping a child self-soothe or get in touch with their feelings. That would be sort of the maternal role, and it would be helped by having a involved mother in their life, not so much the parental side. However, I feel like if we do not have harmony between the male and the female, if we don't have a good relationship between the parents, or if it's a single mother, for instance, that lack of support for her, that lack of a partner, the lack of the masculine side of the balance can actually cause her to be a less effective mother, and thereby not help their child go through or normalize some of these autistic issues.
Right. I'm wondering, because we know that an aspect of autism is unquestionably biological. But so in the early 90s, for example, when ADD became the psychological disorder to label every child who was a little bit overactive, had a little bit, I don't know, too much energy. And by the way, ADD in many ways is a male, I would say, not oriented, but male targeted disorder by the DSMV and the American Psychological Society. It was targeted at boys more than girls because males tend to be more active in a young age. Yeah, ADD was fashionable at the time, and essentially it's not just fashionable, it's that we just basically discovered it, much as we were starting to discover autism in the early 2000s. So my question and part of my concern here is that just as ADD was very oriented at males, not so much because they had a disorder, but because they were males, I think that it's possible that having a distressed or a non-extant father relationship could be explanatory for why we see a rise in the diagnoses of autism. Now, part of that is because we have more awareness, just as with ADD. Part of that could also be because we have a rise in fatherlessness. So that aspect, particularly for males, of understanding social situations is now missing.
Yeah, they don't have an example of how to self-soothe like a man. If they're a boy, they're gonna have to grow into a man. They don't really have an example of how to be as they're growing through it. And I definitely also add that it's not just that we're more aware of it, because of course we had creative geniuses and autistic savants who plenty of number of them in the population back centuries ago. They just weren't recognized as autistic. They were just, a weird guy who doesn't make eye contact, who is really good at these things. Who's very smart. But I do think that also our how we're feeding ourselves and the pesticides, sort of the industrial revolution has definitely had an effect. And I do believe that environmental factors that, because of the progress of society, can definitely be adding to that as well. So it's not necessarily so much that we're noticing it more, but we're noticing it, and we're also perhaps living in ways or have these runaway things that happen in our society with food and with like chemicals and all sorts of innovations of the petrochemical and all of that stuff that can be adding to that. But we cannot underestimate or underscore enough the idea that having a well-adjusted, balanced relationship among the parents, between the two parents, as well as having the child's relationship to their parents and access to both the masculine and the feminine is extremely important. And I would like to extend this to not just for fathers, as you were mentioning in the beginning, Hannah, there, but the need or the benefit of having fathers. I think that also extends very strongly to teachers, and we have an extreme prejudice against men and their relationship with young kids, and automatically, I was just watching Eliza Schlesinger's new Netflix special, and I kind of suspect she's a tiny bit MRA, but she had to clothe her special, clothe it, and calling herself a feminist and saying that's a feminist joke, and she dropped the word feminism like 3 times. But then she also revealed to women all the bullshit things they're doing as women, and she this great line, if I just a side note of talking about, for instance, women can dress however they want, right? And no means no. However, when you dress very provocatively and then don't put out, it's the equivalent of coming home to your boyfriend and saying, oh my God, honey, I had the worst day. I got fired and I cried in front of everybody, and then a car won't start, and then her boyfriend coming in, oh, honey, come here, give me a hug. You want to talk about it? And then turning around and going, ha, psych. So
I'm going to watch the game now.
Exactly.
Oh, geez. Yeah, and
that's is exactly what men experience. But more to the point, there's this aspect of what she was talking about in the special, is that women are not creepy or scary. She can come up to a playground and play with the child and touch the chubby little cheeks and ask a mother to touch her infant, and her mother being like, oh yeah, get in there, you bite his little leg, like, you do it.
She'll hand you her infant and be like, hey, can you watch him for a minute, and walk away.
Yeah.
Oh
my God.
Well, there's
Women
another
are
aspect
not scary or creepy. And by extension, men are, and like she said, all a man has to do is part his hair the wrong way. And
Or
he's suddenly
just
scary and
be
creepy.
at the park without a woman.
Yes, and so this insane attitude that we now have towards men and their relationship with children is insanely damaging, because a lot of the teachers that we used to have, especially in like physics and physical education, which are still men, but a lot of other things like even art class and physics and math and English, whatever have you, used to have a lot more male teachers, and that can provide a different way of looking at things, not just for the boys that are in the class, but for the girls too, because some of the girls can benefit from that as well. Especially if we go back to elementary school or kindergarten. As you were mentioning in the intro, there's a tremendous amount of benefit from the guided play, or the sort of having a looser boundaries when it comes to exploring your own ability and things like that, that males provide, not just fathers, but male role models, male caregivers, male caretakers. For instance, my partner, he was the babysitter for all. His sisters are 8, 9, and 10 years older than him, so he's had to, and they married at 18 and had kids, and he's been taking care of all of those children, and some of their first words were his name. So I mean, it's not like men can't do good at taking care of kids. We have continuously kept pushing men out of this circle of caregiving more and more and more, and so it ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy on that front too. We've pushed men out so far that they don't even know how to deal with children anymore, and there are plenty, of course, who do, and we don't let them, but the more we don't let them, the less they have the ability to do it. So it's just a really toxic situation overall.
You know what's very
Well,
funny?
I want to point something out,
Yeah, go ahead.
because we've had this point brought up regarding attention deficit disorder, and I pointed out in the chat it was the fashion at the time. One of the things I've noticed with the medical profession is the diagnosis of the day becomes like it's overdiagnosed, partly because when you get a case that is borderline, and I think most cases of ADD are either borderline or not ADD. Because I've known a very select few people who actually do have the disorder, and it's a very stark difference in the way their ability to sort things out around them is between them and other people. And I think a lot of people get diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder for being kids. What happens, I think, is a lot of times women in the classroom, female teachers, get impatient with the students. They don't want to try to handle 38-year-olds who all act like 8-year-olds and who are all very energetic and so on. Then you have single moms who have a tendency, women do have a tendency to accept whatever authority says and not question it. So if somebody puts a label on their child, they're like, oh my God, my child has this problem. I have to take them to the doctor. I have to get them the medication, this and that. Whereas the father is more likely to say, well, wait a minute, I have been raising this kid for 8 years, and what the teacher is describing is not the child that I have at home. What's going on? Let's look into this further. And they're both valid responses that need to be balanced out by each other, because you have dad's more likely to doubt the diagnosis and mom's more likely to immediately start acting on it, where you need somebody to have that doubt, and you also need somebody to push for, once the diagnosis is established and doubt is alleviated, start acting on, what do we do about this? So you have those two, again, balancing each other out. Well, when you take men out of the classroom and the home, then you have a situation where the label gets flung around because of the teacher's frustration, and because it's the diagnosis of the day, and because there is, in medicine, there's a hesitance to contradict hysterical parents. Doctors are afraid of being sued, and rightfully so, especially in the U.S., we're the most litigious society, I think, in the world, in terms of this type of litigation. And so then at the other end of it, there's nobody to say, this child doesn't deserve this label, this child is fine. Or this child simply needs the excess energy accommodated. This child doesn't need to be drugged. This child doesn't need to be treated as defective, like a defective girl instead of the boy that he is. And there's nobody to balance out that cycle of labeling and lack of questioning and medical reticence in terms of avoiding slapping the diagnosis of the day on everyone. So that's a factor I think is important in that end of the discussion. I think it does the same thing. I think moms are more likely to be hysterical about men in the park because they don't see them anywhere else. If there's no man at home, they don't have a husband, they don't have even a live-in boyfriend who is the father of their children, and they go to school and the only man in the building is the principal or the janitor. And they take their kids to church, and none of the men in the church are involved in any of their church activities with children. And every place they take their kid, it's women, women, women. And then they go to the park and there's a man there. That's an alien to them.
Right. I've seen some data on this, but I would need to have a refresher on it, because I've looked at, for example, as you know, probably recently there was the big decision of allowing the Boy Scouts to allow girls into it. So I did a lot of research on what was the involvement of non-parental paternal figures in children's lives. And they appeared to be extraordinarily positive, with very little detriment outside of, well, the same kind of negative detriment you have from female molesters. That was it. It was like, the same kind of thing. Women who molest children obviously are detrimental, just as males who molest children and such. But overwhelmingly positive, that is such a small number of people. There are positive influences from males and females towards children from society outside of the mother and father system. However, that is, of course, the most accessible one. So, I find it frustrating because not only at this point have we sort of eliminated just the father figures, we've eliminated any positive male role models. Really? I mean, what positive male role models does the average sixth, seventh grader have in the United States? Because it is really, I would imagine, a scary place to be as a man, to be a coach at this point.
And you wonder why our kids are idolizing professional athletes and professional musicians and so on.
And YouTubers.
Professional YouTubers that are men. And actually, I think the idolization of Jordan Peterson is, and I think we've said this before,
Yes.
I think it's a result of particularly boys, but girls as well, being just starved for paternal figures. They don't even have to necessarily be father figures. There are young men and women with dads who are, because of the way society treats men, they're afraid to fully be dads in their own way, in their own right. I've seen that as well. They kind of defer to mom all the time because they'll lose her if they don't, and if they lose mom, they lose everything. So you have that going on with, they've got, and they don't have, their male family members aren't allowed as close as male family members used to be. They don't have youth coaches that are men. They don't have all these things. So who do they have to look at but famous men? And unfortunately, when you're dealing with that, you're dealing with the amplification of the extreme ends of the individual's character. Their normal everyday self doesn't get communicated to the general public because it's not newsworthy, it's not exciting, it's not special, it's not anything that, like, that's everyday stuff. Who wants to read about that, right? So you have, if they go over the edge, or if they do something absolutely unbelievably great, or if they're accused of something and then you never hear whether they actually did it or not, or if something bad happens to them, but you don't necessarily hear how you might get to hear them talk about the secrets of their success. You might get to hear about their biography and so on, but you don't see them making everyday decisions. And that's a big deal with kids. You know, a lot of my influences in my life came from watching the men around me make everyday decisions, like calling in sick to work or not calling in sick to work despite feeling very much like calling in sick to work, you know, or I'm not going to have a beer with dinner because I have to drive, or, you know, just little things that you see every day with the men in your life. Yes, it's okay for you to play on the monkey bars. I don't care what the lady over there says. Just do what you're going to do because I know you are good at it, you know. Or, no, don't go in the sandbox because that's the litter box for the neighborhood cats. It's not as much fun to play in there as you think. And it's like... dads and your everyday family members, the things that you get to witness as a kid, your coach, you know, and so on. You watch your coach start chewing gum because he doesn't want to chew tobacco in front of the kids. Those are little things that you're denied as a child when your only male role models are famous men, even if they're great famous men.
Yeah, exactly. Without any role models, and more precisely, without even any ability to have a male role model. Pretty much, because yeah, what do we have? There are so few that are essentially allowed for within the current zeitgeist. That it's a sparse kind of field, and there's not a lot of people I would consider father worthy or paternal sort of material within that pool of individuals.
Yeah, and I think some of that also has to do with something you were talking about, Hannah, really keyed me off on this, that those little things like watching a man in your life or a father figure or what have you make decisions or verbalize or express their inner thought pattern, that is extremely important, as you were saying. But I don't think we're seeing that as much anymore as we used to, because men, not only some are afraid, of course, and others have just learned that in this current atmosphere, nobody cares. Nobody's going to listen to them. Nobody cares to know what is going on inside them, and we're losing a valuable resource because of that. And I think we need to provide. Feminists need to live up to their idea of a safe space and provide an actual genuine safe space. And what I mean by that is a mosh pit, is a place where we can all bump into each other and it'd be okay, because that is what is reality. Humans constantly run into each other physically, emotionally, however you name it. We're constantly bumping into each other, affecting each other, hurting each other, helping each other. It is a mosh pit, and we need to have understanding and forgiveness and a truly therefore safe space for people to express themselves, for men to express themselves. I realize that men are not necessarily the most vocal or verbal kind. They do deal with their feelings, etc., through actions, but just simple things like, why is dad doing X? Like a verbalization of his inner thoughts, forget feelings, but just a verbalization of his thoughts. I think we're starting to lose that too, because of the current atmosphere that is so geared towards paying attention to women and amplifying the tiniest feeling and emotion, which of course is a detriment to those women. I can name countless of studies, and as well as personal anecdotes. And in fact, there's a great article recently, or a blog post written by Ayala Girl that I retweeted, where she had her own thoughts on the Me Too movement and the fact that she didn't think that she was assaulted in any way. But then when she thought about it, she actually has had scary experiences, but she refused to sort of think of it as a victim. She refused to think of it. She just didn't think of it as like a systemic issue against all women. Like one of her scariest experience of getting, chased through the streets of a foreign city by a hooded man. She didn't know if he was going to rape her or mug her or what, but the way she thought about it, the way she mentalized it, is that, well, I've had many male friends that have been mugged. This is just something that happens to people sometimes. It's a bad thing that happens. It is not related to being a woman. It is not related to being a victim. And to extend that in her own personal life, she grew up in a very sheltered, with an abusive father, and a homeschooled Christian sort of thing. But her experiences were normal to her. And when she started telling people about her experiences later in life, every single one of them acted horrified. I was like, oh my God, how are you coping? How are you dealing with that? And suddenly she had pain and rage she's never had before. So this idea of focusing in on things that can be trivialized. I mean, you have power in your mind to react to things. You can blow them up or you can trivialize. And I think we need to collectively trivialize more things and to de-escalate a lot of these things instead of keep escalating the rape hysteria, escalating the sexual harassment to the point where now female cosplayers there was a female cosplayer that recently got in trouble and had to delete her social media, etc., for being slightly autistic, probably, and not realizing when she was making other girls feel uncomfortable because she thought they were friends. She thought she was in a safe space to grab somebody's butt, but no, apparently not. So even girls aren't safe anymore from this, sexual harassment when all you're doing is playing with people and just establishing boundaries. You can't find out where another person's boundary is until you cross it sometimes. That's just how things work. You're not going to be meeting every single person and them telling you all of their boundaries immediately, spending 3 hours in conversation before you even say hello, establishing boundaries. That's just not how humans work. You have to sort of interact and run into each other and then sort of push each other back like bumper cars and be like, well, no, you can't come in closer than this. And so a lot of those things that are lumped in with sexual assault and rape, things that are legitimate and scary and have a lasting impact on people, a lot of the things that are lumped in with it are just normal interactions where you have to assert boundaries that every single person has to do. And so we can trivialize and de-escalate a lot of these innocuous interactions that, yeah, they may hurt your feelings and they may not feel good, but it's really not a big deal. We can trivialize them. We have that power in our minds. And instead, we keep escalating and escalating to the point where you can't even look at another person. And that's just, I can't express how unhealthy it is. Like, I was ranting about just simple touch deprivation that we have in this puritanical country, to the point where a man touching another man is seen as homosexual, or a person touching another person is immediately sexual. It's like, you realize that in Europe and other countries, people kiss each other.
Yeah, I would say
hello.
That is a little bit different in America. Something that I tend to enjoy some of the more puritanical stuff, but I understand. Oh my goodness, do I understand the importance of physical touch on human health, truly. And I think one of the reasons people get so upset and are so lonely today in America is because we don't have connections the way we used to, like physical connections, physical touch.
Just plain old hug, hand holding, all of these things that would now be seen as sexual, like, oh, those girls are holding hands, there must be girlfriends. I grew up in Soviet, like post-Soviet Eastern Europe. I was holding hands with my friends all the time walking down the street, and they weren't bisexual. Just because I was doesn't mean anything, but it's something that you did. You just held hands. You affirmed affirmed physical contact with another human that was not sexual. It is a way to help with a lot of things. I mean, just look at studies of physical contact on AIDS patients or cancer patients or people who are suffering from loneliness or diseases or whatever. Physical touch can help them heal. It's that freaking powerful.
In fact, with preemies, with a preemie, it can make the difference between life and death, between the preemie not surviving and the preemie surviving. This was when my middle kid, my younger stepdaughter, was a preemie, and I actually didn't know the family yet very well, but one of the things I've since learned is that my husband back then constantly held her because he was the only one strong enough to carry her and the machines around, that they had, have to have oxygen and other things. Blood pressure has to be monitored and so on. And this is a completely helpless baby, younger than a newborn. and the difference between life and death can be having that skin to skin contact, and that's documented.
Yeah, and so we have, once again, as you just very anecdotally pointed out, sometimes a man is the only one who is strong enough physically or mentally to do what is necessary, and we're eliminating not only man's influence on children and babies, we're also eliminating those benefits to men. And then we turn around and go, where have all the good men gone? Why are all the men psychos? Well, maybe because they haven't been touched their whole fucking life.
What a shock! Really a puzzler there. Makes me scratch my head. I think that's bizarre though, as well, because not only do we see this consistently in the data, we see this through the data empirically time and time again, that there are positive influences on every aspect, essentially, of child development from the input of the father. This is another study, if we want to bring it up, or this paper, the Alan Carey study, 2002. This one brings up a number of pieces that you let me have that, which has a lot of just general overview of, gee, dads are good. It's good to be a dad, and it's unfortunate that we have a society not only that discourages fatherhood in the many ways we've described for such a long time, but even as we've been describing here, not just fatherhood, but positive male influence from any direction. Because I don't know where to start with this. There's so many.
Second.
This page here, this piece of research is just paragraph after paragraph of a summation.
Okay, I don't know if I lost everybody or I just lost sound there for a second, so I'm bringing it back.
But just to say, this is the Allen and Carey, the Allen and Carey Daily piece, which has just fantastic overview of, if anybody in the chat as well would be interested in just seeing the overview of why it's good to be a dad. This is a fantastic.
Yeah, this one is it's ecdip.org. That is the Father Involvement Initiative of Ontario, from the Ontario Network. That is linked in the Patreon post that has the transcript of the opening video, and actually all five of the things that I have on my screen have gone back and forth on my screen. Those are all linked at the bottom of that, and that page is linked in the low bar of this stream. So if anybody wants to find the links that we're talking about here, the information that we're talking about, this one in particular, one of the things that's neat about it is that it actually gives you several a huge number of references to look at, and it gives information from each one of them that it goes through early childhood, it goes through later childhood, it goes through adulthood, and then it points out some of the influences that mothers have on father involvement and society has on father involvement, etc. So it's a very well-rounded collection of information from a variety of research.
Yeah, this is one of the best I've actually ever seen in terms of just being condensed, because it does cognitive development, emotional development, social development, and then it describes absence of fathers. So the thing that I find surprising, right, is that this is even still a question. When we have so much research and data that shows us unquestionably that father plays a very important role in the development socially, emotionally, and cognitively in the raising of a child, and yet we continue to allow Papa government to fill this gap that we have no data to indicate it can sufficiently.
Yeah, and I want to point out some of the information in here sort of backs what we've been talking about, some of the things that Anna was talking about. One thing that I wonder, like with Anna bringing up the sort of the hysteria over sex crimes and assaults and things, that when a woman experiences them, society does become a little hysterical in terms of the response, rather than pushing for recovery and trying to support emotional and physical recovery. It's more of a we support wallowing in a sense of being wounded. And I kind of wonder if we have this tendency, women have this tendency, particularly mothers have this tendency to be overprotective. And I mean, but by the time the child is born, we have a huge physical and emotional investment already, in that we have carried the child inside our bodies for 9 months and felt the child developing and seen all of the imagery that you see at the doctor's office, and there's a connection there that's undeniably different than the connection with the father. The father goes through changes during pregnancy as well, but there is something about that physical contact in that basically you're surrounding the child. That you're going to develop this instinct to be overprotective. Don't touch anything. Let's put this in a bubble so nothing ever happens to it. And it takes the balance of the male influence, the father and the male relatives, to even give the child a chance to explore his environment and to learn to take risks and experience the results and assess and develop and grow and so on. So we have this removal of men from children's environment, and they're surrounded by overprotective women from dusk till dawn, from dawn till dusk, the whole 24-hour cycle. And they grow up without any tools for dealing with situations where they've experienced a violation of their person. Other than it's okay when mom does it because it's for my own good, or it's okay when the doctor does it because it's for my own good. But they don't have this experience of having to set and defend their boundaries, necessarily having another person, another child their age, a peer, set and establish and defend their boundaries, because they're not allowed. In fact, it's to the point now where if a kid bullies another kid in class and the bullied child defends himself, he is punished for fighting equally with the bully. So right. They don't differentiate between the child who violated boundaries and the child who was defending boundaries. And it's a very female behavior. And it's a very detrimental behavior in terms of when you are out in the world and someone ignores your boundaries, or someone turns around and says, fuck your boundaries, I want your money, or fuck your boundaries, in fact, your boundaries are a reason for me to attack you. Then you turn around and you have no basis, no emotional and social basis on which to process this experience. It's an alien experience, and once again, that there's no way to parse it, and there's no way to refrain from a hysterical response.
One of the most fascinating things about that is actually when you look at the information and the research that at least I've read on child psychology, is that girls, for example, more feminine bullying, feminine kind of stuff, it takes place completely outside of the visual ability for a teacher to inspect, right? It happens within the playhouse. It happens away from the teacher because it's psychological bullying. So essentially what is happening is that the normal masculine assertions of dominance have been removed. The typical, which happen usually in front of everybody, because it is a public display of dominance in some way. That has been removed. It becomes all this private, public, or this non-public, private, behind the scenes displays of dominance. And that's very interesting, because it does totally change. We've already talked about a complete change of the social structure when we start to remove men, which is essentially what we've done, is remove men. And when you talk about particularly children, though, and that behavior of what gets seen by teachers, what gets seen by coaches, what gets seen by the adults who get to have any kind of influence on this, the more feminine behavior is what is essentially being either actively or passively, actively meaning it's, being encouraged, or passively being such that the teachers don't see it, and therefore it's still being encouraged, although, not directly. It's the feminine behaviors, the feminine social ostracization rather than physical, that is now become not only the norm, but the only type of ostracization, the only type of social interaction that is being encouraged or at large. So we do start to see this even at a very early age, that typical masculinity is being not just destroyed, but removed from the situation, from the fathers, from the coaches and schools in terms of sports, and in fact from the teachers from age 3, when they start to enter preschool and they do not have the opportunity to be aggressive, because you can't be aggressive. That's bad. So what instead happens is this behind the scenes feminine type bullying that's very social rather than physical.
And I
Well,
also
yeah,
kind of wonder when they're demonizing all aggression like that, if it makes it hard for, in particular, boys to differentiate between positive aggression when you are defending yourself and negative aggression when you are assaulting someone else.
That's the problem, because how can they differentiate without play? Because play is how children and how we all come to understand the world, is through enacting it through a game, essentially. If males and boys can't play act aggression healthily, how can they ever come to learn it in any way that's not healthy, or that is anything but unhealthy, I should say?
well, yeah, we go way back to the primate world with that. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head there with the masculine aggression is public displays of dominance in order to assert their position visibly in front of everyone in the masculine hierarchy of alpha, beta, male, etc. Which actually I would absolutely love to recommend a TED Talk, which I wish I remember the name of it, but it is by the man who first essentially is sort of responsible for the term alpha male. And it's called The Surprising Science of Alpha Males, and by Franz de Waal. And I will link it in our chat, so maybe it could be shared. Because what alpha males actually do, true successful alpha males, because there are some alpha males that are bullies who get once they stop being an alpha male, a lot of them just get fucking killed. They have no legacy, nobody loves them. But true alpha males, they get taken care of like an honorary elder grandfather after they are no longer alpha male, because the primary role of an alpha male in a monkey society is, well, there's two things that they do. First is they mitigate conflict between females and others. So usually it's female. So whenever females are fighting, it is the alpha male's job to be impartial and to separate them. And the second thing they do is bring comfort. Tell me that doesn't sound like the daddiest daddy that ever daddied. So the actual true alpha males that exist in the primate world, they're not a one out for himself alpha male who just shits on everyone. That is an unsuccessful alpha male. That is a male who will probably not become an alpha and instead will get his ass kicked. And if he does become an alpha, once again, he has no legacy. He has nobody there for him. But somebody who is a true alpha male, they are more like a father than anything else. And yeah, it goes all the way back to monkeys. We have the female hierarchy is something that's extremely important to the females, and they will bicker and fight among each other in ways that are not so public necessarily. Though monkeys do definitely primates strongly rely on everybody seeing what everybody's status is. They are sort of very visual in that sense. But if we translate this to humans, and we all have had these experiences, if we think back to our childhood, Boys are physical, girls are emotional in the sense of how they bring each other pain. Boys fight with their fists, girls fight with their words and with gossip and with social. And when you, Becky, you can't sit with us. Social ostracization, stuff like that. And we all know this. We've all experienced this, and somehow we lose track of that still being how humans operate when we get older. And I'm so passionate about this topic, and I talk about it a lot. The fact that we pay so much attention to the obvious public aggression of men, when a man, just can't, he just had enough and he hits a woman. All we see is him hitting her, but we don't see the days, the weeks, the months of emotional torture that she has been putting him through behind the scenes, because women are really good at not showing their abuse. It's coded into their primate DNA, and it's something that they've practiced all their life. And women are naturally more aware of how society sees them, and they will not transgress certain boundaries. They're more fearful in that sense of social fallout. So they will not do things just instinctually that affect their social standing, because of that's how just humans are. That's how primates, that's how males and females are. And we pay so much attention to the aggressive, outward, obvious maleness, whenever aggression, I guess is the word, of men, because it's so out there and it's so easy to see. And we somehow forget this lesson taught to us by childhood, that women have toxicity too. They just have it in a way more subtle expression. And we somehow completely lost sight of that.
Well, and I think one of the bits of research that we were looking at in this paper we were just referencing kind of not enhances that, but is very much related to that. We're, with boys not being able to differentiate, with boys growing up without fathers there to sort of be the lesson on this is functional aggression, this is positive aggression, versus this is dysfunctional aggression and negative aggression, where you have mothers teaching their boys that all of their aggression, all of their assertion is dysfunctional and damaging and dirty, and wrong. They learn to eliminate the distinctions, and so you have this one paragraph: boys who live without their fathers consistently score lower on a variety of moral indexes, such as measures of internal moral judgment, guilt following transgressions. Because if everything is in transgression, eventually you get to the point where it's you become desensitized to the ability to form a feeling of guilt over getting castigated for something that comes naturally to you yet again. And if you don't see a difference between when you do something harmless that is not a feminine behavior, or that is not, it's an affront to feminine sensibilities, versus when you do something harmful, then you end up blurring the lines between the harmless and the harmful, and it becomes easier to treat the harmful as harmless. If you have to treat the harmless as harmful, that would lead more toward the suicidal level of guilt. That would lead toward the more self-destructive end of it. And so the natural tendency is going to be to just abandon the ability to form guilt. And that's it goes on here. Measures of acceptance of blame, moral values, and rule conformity. They're going to end up basically seeing that women are so rules oriented and so obsessive over it that the rules cease to have any meaning. Girls who live without their fathers are more likely to cheat, lie, and not feel sorry after misbehaving. So once again, they don't have that accountability taught to them, and they don't get taught the difference between when their behavior is harmless and when their behavior is damaging. Both boys and girls are less likely to be able to delay gratification, but they'll have poor impulse control over anger and sexual gratification, and have weaker sense of right and wrong. It is that differentiation that I mentioned before, where we have women get hysterical over everything. Women lump everything in together a lot. Have a tendency to say, well, if there's one poisonous M&M in the bag, one color of M&M is all poison, then all the M&Ms are bad, rather than trying to identify, oh, really, which M&M, what's the one that we have to watch out for, and deal with that. They're more likely to simply say, okay, we can't have any of this type of interaction. We can't have any fun. We can't have any expectation of risk. We can't have any expectation of roughhousing, because it's all wrong and bad, and you just can't do it. And the response that seems to happen is, well, bad doesn't mean anything, and I don't have to care. And I think that may be why we are seeing, the majority of people who make the news for self-destructing in particularly violent ways, and in particular ways that involve violence against the world around them, or ways that involve suicidal violence. You end up seeing a lot of this coming out of single mother homes. And it's not because the mothers are bad, it's because the lack of fathers fails to balance out the natural tendencies of female parenting.
Right, and I think that tends to be the issue that we see over and over again. It's mostly just that, based on the societal norms that we've seen and changed, in particular over the last 20 years, that we don't have the father figures that we did at one point, and it's why we see all kinds of general societal changes. Women being less happy, of course, greater out of wedlock births, and lower. I mean, we see fairly definitive lower outcomes for a lot of students in terms of education. All of these things, we can't necessarily tie them specifically, because you look at a model fit, right? We cannot ever causally link these things, because it's unethical. So we have to look at them through correlational means. But they're fairly strong correlations, right?
Well, that's just
it doesn't just appear out of nowhere, right?
Yeah, and that's just it. And we have a really rough time with this in our society. Examining these things is very painful, especially like we're dealing with a situation where we know from an overwhelming amount of evidence what happens when you take the father out of the picture. We don't have that level of evidence regarding what happens when you take... There is evidence of what happens when you take the mother out of the picture, and there is dysfunction that occurs when you take the mother out of the picture as well. But we don't have the wealth of information, because we haven't done this to as much. This is like the short history of single parenthood is prior to the tender years doctrine in terms of English common law. Fathers, if there was a divorce, fathers had custody, unless they were the ones abandoning the family. And, so if the mother left, she left the home, she left the father, she left the children, and to a degree, he still had some control over her income, but he also had to provide for her unless she left, if there was a fault in place, like she left for another man, or did one of the few things that actually allowed the father to sue for divorce. So you didn't see, like, a lot of women didn't do this because there were consequences. If they did that, they faced poverty, they lost their children, and so on. When it turned around, men weren't going to be leaving because they faced consequences. They would lose their homes. They would lose their contact with their children. They would lose income because, unlike with mothers, a father whose home and children are separated from him is still responsible for financially maintaining the household. And so fathers had even more incentive to not break up the family. And that's increased over time. Well, women, they didn't, their financial incentive and their social incentive to keep the family together kind of died with the tender years doctrine and the child support laws, because now they can leave, especially after no-fault divorce became a thing. So now they can leave. They don't risk losing contact with their children. They don't lose their financial status if they have difficulty with the relationship. It is just as easy, if not easier, to walk away from the relationship than it is to work on the relationship. And so we have women who leave their families due to anything from passing attraction to another man to boredom. Boredom is actually cited as a reason for divorce now. And they're breaking up their families. They're taking their children away from the fathers. And they're taking the fathers away from the children because they are bored. So we have this wealth of information because we have this epidemic. And I would call it an epidemic, even though if you look at post no-fault divorce, we're seeing a lot more. We're not seeing a lot more splitting up today than we did, say, 20, 30, even 50 years ago. So people are like, well, there's not an epidemic of divorce. It's been like this for half a century. I would call it an epidemic because we are dealing with a situation now where more kids are being raised in single-parent homes than two-parent homes. That's an epidemic. And that is where this information comes from. This has been going on for decades, and it's been increasing for decades, and it's happening to half or more of the children in this country.
Right, exactly. And that's really where the struggle, I guess, and the pain here comes from, is that so many children just don't have the option anymore to know their fathers. And due to the divorce system, due to the current family, legislation system, or the way that families are split in American legislation. And as we've discussed at length here, the fact that we can't even have non-parental father figures without, oh, they're a pedophile. Oh, they shouldn't be around children. The idea that this is endemic, I think, in the society in the West at this point, at least in the Americas, or in America, I should say, which is that men have no place around children. And that is, I mean, it's in part because of the pedophile thing, but it applies to almost everybody. And it's terrifying because it means that, yeah, there's no opportunity in many cases for males to have any male role models. Outside the fact that, as we all know, that they often, when divorce is involved, generally speaking, they're going to be removed from their fathers for the vast majority of their time spent, because it's very rare for fathers to get custody. So we're already talking about children having very little time to spend with a male figure, and now we're saying they can't spend any time with any other male figures. Yeah, this is ultimately negative, and the data are consistent that this is not good. That being around a male figure is good for, guess what, males and female children. It's good for everybody. Both genders kind of exist for a reason beyond just the, pollination, right? Our species is not R selected, right? So we don't just put our genes out there and leave. Our species is designed to raise children together. So it's very silly to me that we have this whole misunderstanding of the role of fathers and the role of positive male role models.
Well, and this the other aspect of that then is women who boot the father figures out of their children's lives, particularly the fathers themselves, but who exclude men from their children's lives in general, are cutting off their nose to spite their face. And apparently Microsoft really wants me to know something right now that is not at all important to the show. Sorry about the sound effect, everybody. Because I know that broadcast. But anyway, this is something that... Now, I watched this on a personal level. Because my family has a divorce situation. My husband has an ex-wife, and there were a number of times when I watched her just draw back and shoot herself in the foot with as big of an ammunition as she possibly could, just to get back at him. And I'm laughing about it now, but at the time it was just infuriating because it hurt everybody in the situation. Like a mom can't shoot herself in the foot without collateral damage. That's just not going to happen. But in any case, this is something that, for some reason, so many divorced mothers and single moms and women whose kids go to school where there are men, or women who chase them in out of the park, they do not understand the resource that they are not only abandoning but avoiding in men. This is a situation where putting your foot down is hard. It's particularly hard for women, and having a unified front with dad, between mom and dad, that is incredibly helpful with kids. You say, hey, this is the rule is for your safety. The other end of it is, I can't count how many times, because our kids are not just intelligent, they're creative, they're inquisitive, they're fascinated by the world around them. You have this discussion between the parents when the kid's not around. The kid is interested in X. How are we going to handle that? And the kid is interested in hanging out with this particular type of person. The kid has made an association that might not be the best for him or the association, or the kid is interested in physics but not mature enough to handle the level of study, whatever. And or the kid is interested in gymnastics. Oh my God, he's gonna break his neck, and you have mom and dad have these discussions, and then by the time they make the decision of, this is how mom and dad are going to support the kid's decision, this is how mom and dad are going to try to influence the kid's decision, this is how mom and dad are going to put their foot down, they're ready to do it together. And I can't count how many times it's been essential that my husband and I work together on stuff, because a lot of these decisions, just unilaterally making them, isn't just intimidating. It can go horribly wrong.
I think, that's absolutely correct. And the thing that, beyond everything we know, because again, check out that Patreon link, guys, and you can get access to some of these new studies, but also I'll just cite it again. This one, which is cool, which is Sarah Allen and Carrie Daly, 2002, which is an Ontario piece. Just good overview. It is so obvious, and this is older, 2002. The research that has been conducted since then is unquestionable, that fathers and mothers both play an important role in the development of children. So when we start to remove fathers, it's obvious that there's a detrimental effect. The people who call for this, on some level, have to know it, I think, which is what I find most disturbing, is that people who say, they have to, on some level, if they have any kind of experience in developmental psychology, have some experience with the data that are without question, that are unquestionably indicating that fathers have a positive effect, that there's a specific and unique positive effect of, by the way, not just all male figures, but specifically from the data that I have seen on genetic paternal fathers on childhood development. Those data, from what I have seen, are pretty consistent. The fact that we don't acknowledge that is disturbing to me. Because to me, what it illustrates is that Generally speaking, either people within the government, depending on your government, or people within different NGOs and groups don't want the average person to understand the importance of the father, when in reality we have this, very matriarchal society ultimately in terms of how it is now, this gynocentric society that does not recognize the incredible importance that fathers have on every aspect of childhood development, being just as important as every aspect of the mother on childhood development. This should be, I would think, to all of us, to you in the chat, everybody, and I think to all of us here, should be self-evident that, of course, the mother and father are equally important, just as they have equal parts to do with the creation of the child. It's not really a surprise that they have pretty much equal parts to do with the development, thereby, of the psychology of a child. This seems obvious, and the data support it. So the fact that we're denying this right now is, when I see people deny this in the academic literature, is beyond disturbing to me, because it means that someone wants to hide it, essentially. That's just sad. We should celebrate fatherhood on every level as much as how much do we celebrate motherhood on every level? You're a mother. It's the best thing you can be. And that's great. It is probably one of the best things you can be. So is being a father. Why is one so elevated over the other?
And this is something that, I had to question this. This is a rough thing to look at. What the hell kind of an agenda would be behind encouraging the level of dysfunction that is being encouraged by feminists in terms of hating fathers, removing them from the home, sabotaging the relationship, not only between fathers and their children, but fathers and the mothers of their children, sabotaging women's ability to cooperate with men in the mentoring of children, not just in terms of mother-father child relationships, but parent-teacher-child relationships, teacher-teacher and teacher-administrator-child relationships, and so on. This is one of those situations that you got to look at this and go, what are these people thinking? What are they trying to do that they are so intent on promoting this dysfunction? And I have a rough time personally drawing a conclusion from this that is in any way, shape, or form even neutral, much less flattering to feminism. And then when I look at there's further information. If you think about this, the research that we have been looking at also shows that kids of involved fathers are less likely to engage in criminal behavior, they're less likely to end up as unwed teenage parents, and they're less likely to end up on welfare. They're more likely to have job success. They're more likely to have success in obtaining higher incomes, right? They're more likely to be the better taxpayer. Like I talked about in the opening segment, it is a boon to society when children have their fathers involved. And the importance of that to society is in lower crime, obviously. It's also in a greater amount of able-bodied taxpayers. It's in a more ordered society. It's in having to, or not having to have so much government intervention in people's lives. It seems almost as though the goal in separating fathers from their families, therefore, would be in creating a societal environment, a social environment that necessitates government intervention in individuals' lives, and would pave the way for more and more government intrusion into people's lives, basically. More and more micromanagement, more and more legislation for the point of micromanagement, more and more departments and agencies. If you look, I think I've said this before, Wikipedia has a page that is that basically goes through and has from A to Z, a list of government agencies and departments, and each letter has several. So we're looking at a situation where it's not irrational to question whether this is a deliberate breakdown of society, at least a deliberate attempt at the breakdown of society. And, I hate to sound paranoid, but what else can you conclude from an orchestrated political effort to remove the condition that seems to be the linchpin of a functional society, and that is intact families?
Well, like I said, or not me, but never attribute to malice that which can be adequately by stupidity. Or as Temple more diplomatically puts it, ignorance. And then that's where the question is, are they ignorant or are they willfully ignorant? Because willful ignorance becomes malicious intent by virtue of not doing the due diligence.
Yeah, exactly. And therein, that's the issue, right?
Yeah, that's my issue. Like, it would be different if this research was all new. But if you look at the dates, there's a range. And, for instance, the point about boys who live without their fathers consistently score lower on a variety of moral indexes, and it goes through several of them, that is Hoffman, 1971. I was born the next year. So this is over 46 years old. This information has been around. We know this, and we've known this for a long time. And a lot of the studies are 1991, 1996, 1994.
Well, see, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people who actually do look into the research are more masculine-minded, less postmodernist types of people. And I think currently and for the past, 30 years, we've had infiltration or at least upholding of the feminine postmodernist. There are no hierarchies. Science doesn't matter. Heavy focus on gender studies, women's studies, and I think we are currently, of course, in an information overload place where you can't even necessarily tell truth from fake news or what have you, because there's just so much information out there, and that gives rise to selective hearing, selective reading, selective thinking.
Yeah.
And so on one hand, you have an information overload. On the other hand, you have the postmodernist attitudes towards science and research. And it's like, well, some man did that research, so why should I care? Our focus is on gender studies, and our narrative is X. And so, because they don't necessarily even believe in the hierarchy and ultimate truth that can be sussed out through science, that's a very toxic combination of just they end up believing what Wizard's First Rule, which is Terry Goodkind wrote this book series called Sword of Truth, and there are Wizard's rules, and the first one is people are stupid. That's the shorthand. The longhand is that people will believe that which they're afraid of or want to be true. And so we are victims to Wizard's First Rule, I think, when it comes to these researchers or people who are in these positions. They're mostly women.
I will try to offer a few pieces there of explication. Not all, not all are women.
Mm-hmm.
There is a female slant, unquestionably, in the academy when it comes to the social sciences towards women. That is unquestionable. I would say, however, that it is not so simple as we just publish bullshit. Now, be very careful where you are reading your data from. When you see something, though, that is empirical and it is providing hard science, we're doing like structural equation models or log logistical regressions or something like that involve statistics and number crunching. It doesn't matter if it's a woman who's running it. We're pretty much doing science, even if it's soft science, according to most people. When you see the more post-positivist or the postmodernist kind of stuff, excuse me, I'm a post-positivist. We see the more postmodernist kind of stuff, which is there's no objective reality, everything is subjective. That's kind of how can we define it? By their own admission, reality doesn't exist. There is no objective reality. So how do we measure it? everything that I do is measurable. This is where you get into the conundrum of the fuckery of philosophy, right? Of modern philosophy, because can you measure things or can you not? Essentially, I believe you can measure things, and I don't believe in anything you generally can't measure. But people also think that that's inaccurate, and I understand that point as well. So this is where we arrive at the question, though. They would say that all of the data we have described is bad because it is masculine in some way. It is controlled by men, even if women conducted it. There has been some masculine influence, and objective reality is controlled by the patriarchy. So we can never understand their subjective version of reality, which they admit is subjective, I believe. So essentially, we end up in a crossroads of nothing can ever be rectified here. Now, I would just say I don't care about anything that can't be measured, and that's me. But other people who have other opinions can have other opinions.
Now, I think with social research, it's kind of hard to. There are ways to measure things, and I think, and then we also run into the issue of there are ways to manipulate the ways we measure things. Like a great example of that, or an egregious example of that, however you want to put it, would be Mary Peacoss and her sexual violence prevalence research, in which she manipulated the methods of measurement in order to maximize the apparent incidence of sexual violence against women and minimize the apparent incidence of sexual violence perpetrated by women. And if one were to give the same set of questions to men and women with the same behaviors being defined as the same types of sexual violence, so forced coitus, forced fellatio, forced cunnilingus, all being these are rape, rather than making a list of who penetrates what with what and when and how. Forced anal sex, rape. Very easy way to define it. You would find that approximately 40% of what she got in her answers is female perpetrated rape. About 40% of the rape that she found. Now, her questions were also designed to increase the incidence by counting things as rape that the victim didn't necessarily consider to be rape. But that's another side of it. If you, for instance, change your mind about sex because you became relaxed after you received alcohol from another person, did that person commit a rape? It's not. Is that the same as being passed out on the floor and having someone take advantage of your unconscious body? Because there's a very wide variety of differences of opinion on that. And so when you look at what's being measured there is, by strict feminist standards, rape is much more prevalent than it is by the standards that are prevalent in society on sex. And it all depends on how much agency you afford to the individual over choices like, I made a decision after I had a beer versus I had no beer in my system when I made that decision, versus I was passed out on the floor and somebody did something to me. You know, those are three different situations. And in terms of parenthood and influence on kids, it's a little bit different in the means of measuring things, because you're not necessarily measuring kids' decisions and treating them as though they don't have the agency that they have if they're girls versus boys. You're looking at, does this behavioral change, or does this pattern of behavior, or this pattern of incidents, this pattern of demonstration of cognitive ability, this pattern of success or failure in school or in professions, does this correlate to presence or absence of a father in the home? Does this correlate to involvement with the father or lack of involvement with the father. And the other thing is we're seeing in some of these areas a prevalence of research where the same result has been found in research spanning decades. Like the one paragraph here that points out peer relations. Kids with involved fathers are more likely to have positive peer relations, be popular and well-liked. Their peer relations are typified by less negativity, less aggression, less conflict, more reciprocity. In other words, they get along better with other kids. They're more socially adept if they have involved fathers. The early research on that was in 1968, but there was still research finding that result in 1999. The research that found the strongest predictor of empathic concern in children and adults is high level of parental involvement while a child, or paternal involvement while a child. So having dad involved when they're a kid helps them to be able to show empathy for others. Sorry. To show empathy for others and to exercise that empathy. That goes back to 1957. And the latest research that's shown in this paper is 1996. So we're seeing these broad spans of time in which this research, various research, found this result over and over again. And these are behavioral measurements, not watching kids do and dealing with it's not quite as difficult maybe as dealing with feminists saying, well, we're not going to call it what it is when the person forcing coitus is a woman, when the person forcing oral sex is a woman, or when the person forcing anal sex is a woman, unless they use something to penetrate the victim instead of forcing the victim to penetrate them, then we'll call it rape because it's the way it's done to a woman. But that's a confounding factor, and we kind of have to examine that in research. But I'm going to go on to the super chats because it's after 9:30 and we're going to end up running out of time. And there are several. And I'm going to do the last one first so I don't have to copy it over to my list because I'm lazy. So deal with it. So Jazzy Jeff Gaming gave us $10. It starts with an A, so I think that's Australian, but I might be... Okay, no, it is Australian. And says, where can I find the source for the causative factors of rape? I once heard one of the Badgers say it was sexual assault as a child. It came up in discussion because of the hysteria here in Australia. There are sources that do point out that is a causative factor. It's not... There isn't the causative factors regarding rape. There's several causative factors, and that's one of them. And one of the things that has been pointed out here in this set of studies, when you see kids without involved fathers, kids who grow up without involved fathers, I'm going to repeat this one, score lower on a variety of moral indexes such as measures of internal moral judgment, guilt following transgressions, acceptance of blame, moral values, and rule conformity. Girls are more likely to cheat, lie, not feel sorry after misbehaving. Both sexes are less likely to be able to delay gratification, have poor impulse control over anger and sexual gratifications, and have a weaker sense of right and wrong. That's an influencing factor right there. That is saying they have less impulse control. This is correlation. This isn't necessarily proof of cause. But when you have a situation where you don't have as much control over your impulses, you don't have as much control over your seeking of gratification, if you also combine that with some of the other research that points to less ability to demonstrate empathy, less ability to get along with one's peers, less ability to differentiate between positive and negative violence, you have a person who is more likely to develop sexual aggression rather than to be sexually assertive and
Yes.
set and respect boundaries. So a person
I think that's
raised
something we have
without
to
a
be very clear
dad,
about too.
this is not saying that single moms raise rapists. I'm not saying that. But failure to include paternal mentorship in a child's life is going to increase the child's risk of developing sexual aggression versus sexual assertiveness, and to fail to be able to navigate and negotiate boundaries properly. So you have a greater likelihood upon being raised by a single mother that the individual you're dealing with is going to be a sexually violent person. And it's very much like the vampire myth. Yes, a person who has been sexually exploited or victimized as a child has that same issue of inability or less ability, lowered ability to navigate and negotiate boundaries between themselves and other people. And they are more likely to become sexually aggressive. They are more likely to be a person who is going to fail at that. So a person who has been victimized as a child and hasn't had any kind of assistance, any kind of therapy, or any kind of rebuilding from the people, the adults around them, that is a person who is more likely to become a sexual predator as an adult, particularly if they grow up learning from the people around them that the way you deal with conflict between your interests and the next guy's interests is violence.
Well, absolutely. And that's one of the things that I think that we don't quite make explicitly clear, which is that violence is not inherently bad. Violence, aggression can be positive. Let's be more accurate. Aggression can be very, very positive for young males to express towards each other. It's enacting. It's a play form of adult behavior in many ways. So we need to understand, though, and need to have these male father figures that allow young males to have a more clear and expressive environment in which to express and to illustrate their more aggressive sort of behaviors, which is totally normal and which they should be allowed to express in a free environment. This is the problem, is that in so many aspects of education at this point, it is based so wholly around female education and not around male, that we don't understand that it's very normal for males to be aggressive, to be violent, even physically. That there's nothing wrong with that, to shove each other, push each other a little bit. That's okay, as long as it's not overly violent. This is play fighting. This is normal. When we remove that, and on top of that, we remove all male role models, including the father, we're going to end up with males who don't have any idea what to do with their testosterone, right? They don't know what to do with their energy, which is an absurdity. It basically is telling half of the population everything you feel is wrong. That's so screwed. And I mean, from childhood, what are we supposed to do for those people? It's ridiculous to me.
It's one of those things that as a society we've been really bad about addressing that. We try to sweep dysfunction under the rug. It's the worst possible thing we can do with it. It's one of those things that it's like a boil, an infected boil. If you put a Band-Aid over it, it's not going to go away. The infection can spread. It can become systemic. It would be the worst thing you could do would be to just, if you have an infected boil that's getting bigger and bigger, just put a bandage over it and pretend it's not there and hope it goes away. You have to treat it with antibiotics or lancing and emptying. Sometimes a combination of both. The same thing is true with dysfunction in our society. Not that we have to take an equivalent action, but there has to be an address of the causes. With an infection, it's bacteria, but with dysfunctional behavior, a lot of times there's a psychological cause behind that traces back to somebody having learned something incorrect. Like I pointed out before, learning that the way you deal with conflict between your own interest and the next guy's interest is violence. You learn that in childhood when you are surrounded by adults who make that their primary means of dealing with conflict between their interests and the next person. So it becomes more difficult in adulthood to unlearn that and then learn that there's a variety of means for dealing with conflict between your interests and the next person's interests. But it can be done. But it's better if we are able as a society to address things in the moment. One of the things that we do with victimization of children is we don't want to admit that it happened, and we don't want to admit the impact, and we don't want to look at it because it's horrible. It's like that moment when the monster appears in a scary movie, and the main character knows they're going to die, and they look away because they just can't stand to see the horror coming. We are so protective of children and so invested in children that we have a really awful time examining when something awful happens to a child. We want to, that was horrible, let's skip over it. And you can't do that. There is a wounded person who needs your support after that. And if you don't want a next generation of violent adults, whether sexually violent or not, whether they target adults or children, whether they attack individuals or property or whatever, you have to be able to deal with this terrible thing sometimes happens to children, and after it happens, if we have failed to prevent it, then we have to support their recovery. And that's the hardest thing. But I'm gonna go on to the rest of the super chats because they built up faster than I thought. Blave Kaiser gave us US $10 and said, women used to like a guy who was good with kids, and for some women it was a turn on. What happened to that? When did it change? Why demonize men who like kids all of a sudden? Now I'm going to point out there are different classes of women.
Yep.
And I'm going to speak up for once in support of tradcons. I know I give tradcons a round of heck about a lot of their attitudes towards men, but this is one area in which they have some functional attitudes. They do appreciate fatherhood, and they do recognize, honestly, one of the sexiest images out there, one of the sexiest images you can create is a picture of a man holding a baby who is invested emotionally in that baby, a family member, a loved one. And of course all men, for the most part, when you put a baby in a man's arms, they might be a little intimidated the way most adults are going to be intimidated if it's not their baby. But it's because they care what happens to the baby. Not because, I don't know what to do with this, but what will happen if I screw up is the fear. What will happen to the baby if I screw up? That is incredibly sexy. But I'm not to say that, women who are not traditionalist conservatives don't also have that capability. But feminists, this is an area where feminists kind of give women a bad name. And it's not even all feminists. It's the gender feminists that hate men. And the political lesbians and those types. They're not a representative sample of the world. And I think we can get back to a point if we recognize that they're not a representative sample of the world and their interests are not the interests of the world. That fathers are appreciated again. We just have to turn the car around. I will turn this car around and we will go back. Well, we need to do that. We need to do that in this situation.
Yeah, that's one of the dangers of spending a lot of time in an online community, because a lot of times what we end up missing is the fact that, for instance, reading comments online on any kind of YouTube video or even articles at this point, it's kind of like diving deep into a sewer porta potty thing. Like, a lot of times there's going to be some really toxic, stupid, just a lot of bad stuff. Not knocking down all those really nice comments that I see, but it seems disproportionately weird to see that many people so angry or so stupid or so toxic. But you got to think about the fact, and I think we lost sight of that, is that anyone who leaves a comment has to be emotionally invested enough in what's going on to comment. And that would be like two people, as opposed to hundreds of people who may agree with what's going on, and they just move on and go on with their day because they agree. They don't have this emotional anxiety need to spill out all of their, conflicting or painful thoughts into the comment. So the same goes with the essentially a vocal minority. And so we end up paying attention because we spend so much time in these artificial communities that have been built up by social media. We spend so much time there that we forget that there's 9 billion people out there in the world, practically. And these people who have access to internet and who care enough to comment and to engage in discourse, they are not representative in the slightest of the rest of the world, even the rest of the country. But that's the other thing too, is that not only is there this country, but there's so many other countries and so many other continents and so many other cultures. And we need to remember that we have created an artificial little playground, and only certain privileged and flame troll type people will be playing around in it. Those people who have access to the internet, those people who, once again, care enough to spew their stuff online, be it positive or negative. They have some sort of pressure in their minds to release this information, and not all of it is because it's activism. A lot of it is just because they're hurt one way or another on the inside. So you got to remember that there are so many other women out there, that feminism does not define even American culture, let alone all the other cultures that are out there.
And that's one that sometimes it gets hard to recognize it because of what we're surrounded by, but it's good to keep in mind, because sometimes these issues can just really weigh you down, especially when you're constantly surrounded by that information. Don't let it destroy your faith in humanity, because most of humanity, what is it, 12% of the population or 18% of the population, something like that, identifies as feminist, which means over 80% of the population does not. So it's, don't get too down over it. Just keep hammering at the information. And speaking of information, Frenchinator2 gave us $5 and says, I have been diagnosed with ADHD and activity. I skipped one. Mark gave us $5 and says, I'm concerned about the long-term effects that Ritalin and Adderall have had on children growing up. Have there been any longitudinal studies on this? Now, I had not looked that up, but I did a quick search. Aydin, if you have something already, you can answer this first.
Let me actually, one sec. I have a piece of data here very quickly. Go ahead, though, because I do have it up here.
Okay, well, one of the things that I found is that there are long-term side effects. And this is something I'm familiar with simply because I had medication as a kid for my asthma that had some long-term side effects like this. If I understand right, these are methamphetamines. They're amphetamines, not methamphetamines, but they're amphetamine stimulants.
It's the same thing. They are stimulants.
Yeah. Hence the line from cringe is the word, I do meth, it calms me down. But these can have effects on your heart. If you consistently take these over time, there's actually, where is it? The U.S. National Library of Medicine from the National Institutes of Health, HHS Public Access Manuscript. So it's available to everybody. And it does point out that there are, especially from abuse of it, but there are some potential physical side effects. And you can have damage to your heart. You can have damage to your central nervous system. You can have some psychological effects.
Anorexia, insomnia, long-term headaches. I'm just looking at the data here I'm seeing right now, which is in about 30% of cases. Additionally, yes, heart problems are potentially included in that.
Right.
So in up to 30% of cases, you're going to be looking at some serious, this is in Adderall that I'm looking at right here. However, also in a similar analysis of Adderall, this is, so I'm going to be looking at the two studies I will be citing here are going to be McGough, McGough, Biederman, Weigel, Lopez, McCracken et al. That's enough. That we don't cite more than 4 usually. That's June 2005. The name of the study is Long-Term Tolerability and Effectiveness of Once Daily Mixed Amphetamine Salts, aka Adderall, in Children with ADHD. That's the one that says it's mostly the anorexia, insomnia, headaches, but also potentially there's some heart issues as well. The other thing I would recommend to read, which is the Farone and Biederman study, which is, I believe, 2002 as well. 2014, actually, excuse me. Biederman, excuse me, Faraone, Faraone, and Biederman, 2014, has a dissemination review, University of York, 2014, basically finds considerably that the Adderall medication works to deal with what we would call ADHD. However, it does, again, have side effects. So, it depends on what you're interested in. You know, if you're interested in whether or not Adderall has side effects, obviously it does. However, it does work significantly more than a placebo in treating the symptoms of ADHD. Therefore, it works. That's all I would say. I read 2 studies very quickly. It works better than placebos.
Oh, okay.
Considerably. The significant, it's a 94%. 95%, excuse me, effectiveness in terms of working better than placebos. Adderall works, but it has side effects, essentially.
Okay, so it's very similar to what I experienced then. I wasn't on medicine for hyperactivity, I was on medicine for asthma, so I had to have steroids. And they put me on a lot of steroids, and steroids can have some very damaging effects on the heart as well, and it can have some there's some neurological effects that steroids can have. I went through 20 years of roid rage, to put it mildly, so bad that I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder for a while, and then later re-examined and found to be perfectly normal in terms of not having a psychological disorder, and a lot of my anger management issues were related to that. So a lot of times you can have a medicine that you need. If you have a diagnosis and your diagnosis is accurate, you can have a medicine that you need, and it's going to have some side effects. But from what I can see, the answer is basically, in medicine, you use drugs which are like a sledgehammer. You use drugs when you have to. And when you don't have to, you rely on other therapies. Other therapies should be the primary response in many, many cases. It's the same thing with antibiotics. Antibiotics fuck up your flora. Just to put it right out there, your gut is an ecosystem. Your body is an ecosystem. It's not just a biological organism. It's an ecosystem which relies on the bacteria that it hosts in your gut in order to facilitate proper digestion. And if you use antibiotics a lot, like if you're like me and you grew up with a compromised immune system and you get sick all the time as a kid, you're going to go through a risk of destroying the flora in your gut to the point I can't think of what the infection is called, but there's an infection you can get in your gut, C. diff. I can't remember the long name for that, but it basically is a result of abuse of antibiotics, which back in the 70s and 80s was really, really prevalent because moms would go to the doctor and demand them and badger the doctor into prescribing them for fear of being sued if he didn't.
Pretty much, yep.
So antibiotics are vital in terms of if you get pneumonia and it's a bacterial pneumonia, you're not going to get rid of it without antibiotics. But if you get a virus and you hit that with antibiotics, it doesn't do anything other than damage your flora in your system. The same thing is true with ADD drugs or the steroids I had to take when I was a kid. There are times when use of them is inevitable. And there was a lawsuit, there was a class action lawsuit against the maker of theophylline, which is one of the drugs, one of the steroids that I was on when I was a kid. I didn't participate. I have an arrhythmia in my heart, and I had psychological effects from that medication, but I didn't participate in the lawsuit.
Oh, fuck, really?
Yeah, because I'm alive because of that medication.
Yeah, well,
like it just seemed immoral for me to demand money because as a side effect of them keeping me alive. It's like demanding money from somebody because when they were doing CPR, they broke your ribs.
Okay.
There are things that you
my
can't
mother
help.
also has an arrhythmia that she was born with, and but she was born in the 60s, so like significantly in the past, late 50s, early 60s, and they didn't
I was born in
do
72.
anything back then. Okay, so they didn't do anything back then. They were just like, you had an arrhythmia, all right, we'll do anything that we can to fix it. I'm guessing though over time they started to make that more difficult.
Yeah, mine wasn't discovered until adulthood, but it was something that they looked at, like, we can't find a specific deformity causing this. They just know that I have heart palpitations sometimes, and it's been attributed to the medication.
Oh shit! So they think
there's damage
with the medication.
Yep.
Okay, so my mom's arrhythmia is congenital.
Yeah, mine was not. I didn't have that problem until it was one of those things that started in adolescence and then got worse over time. And that's part of the reason it started in early adolescence, and I would have it, like once in a blue moon, and then over time, well, I was on that medication from the time I was 2 years old until in my 20s. And
holy shit.
Yeah, well, it was that or suffocate. Suffocating really sucks. Just for the record. So, I mean, this is something that, like, yes, these medications do have dangerous side effects, and they should be reserved for situations. This is why I really am irate about schools trying to prescribe them. Your kid's teacher, should be educating your child in reading, writing, arithmetic, history, art, whatever their focus is. They are not doctors, and they should not be demanding that you put your child on any medication. Your child has a right to have any medical decisions made by the parent consulting a doctor, not an educator. And this is something that I get really, really irate about this. That when I found out the schools were pushing these drugs, that was one of those moments where you talk about challenge and anger management. Like, okay, the wall is not responsible for this. If I hit it, it's only gonna hurt my hand. These are kids, and I know what can happen when you subject a little body to a lot of drugs. And you end up with I would call it the lady who swallowed the fly syndrome. You have the first drug for a particular reason. You take this medicine for, like me, with asthma. Gotta have this medicine or you're gonna suffocate. All right, take the drug. Then they say, well, you got these side effects. Okay, well, we're gonna add some more drugs to treat the side effects. So you swallow the spider to catch the fly, and next thing you know, you've got side effects from the second set of drugs. And so you got to swallow the bird to catch the spider. And you can see where I'm going with this. And the next thing you know, you're dealing with a little horse. And that's a problem. But in terms of, so another side effect of the drugs is more drugs. But in terms of need, you use the drugs when the doctor says there is a valid need. And if you've got kids that this is brought up, your kid may have ADD, your kid may have Asperger's, your kid may have depression. They're starting to be more adept at diagnosing bipolar in younger people,
which I'm very happy about. I would say though, a problem with bipolar is bipolar often doesn't manifest until
Much
early
older.
20s.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Which,
So,
when I developed bipolar, I was 23,
right,
you
right.
know, which sucked because I had no idea, you know. So bipolar, whatever, sucks, you know. But all the improvements we can make in mental health are good ones, for the most part. I just worry that sometimes people get put into
Boxes.
categories and boxes
Yeah.
that aren't helpful for them. And that's my biggest fear, really, is that because it happens to everybody. People who have depression get put into bipolar and vice versa. That's not helpful at all. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's another side effect of, like, you jump to the diagnosis, then you jump to the drugs, then you put the person in a box, and rather than dealing with the manifestations of symptoms in their experience, you deal with the textbook, and you deal with the
Well, right.
definition, and you deal with the label. And that becomes a problem as well. So there's long-term effects of Ritalin and Adderall on children growing up, but they're not the only risks of misdiagnosis and overuse of the diagnosis and overuse of labeling.
No. And I mean, it's actually interesting that somebody just made a comment about it. But the thing is, people who have bipolar or autism, a lot of these disorders, myself included, we can't escape from it.
No.
Even if you're medicated and you're treated for bipolar, as I am, people will always judge you for having bipolar, even when you're medicated and treated. As, you know, like, you're completely fine. You don't experience manic episodes anymore, or long-term depressive episodes. It doesn't matter. People will still say, oh, you're bipolar, you're crazy, you're psychotic.
Or it becomes the reason for your opinions. You can't have opinions anymore because you have this label, and therefore anytime they disagree with something that you said or a choice you want to make or your self-advocacy, that's another one. Oh, well, you're just in a mood. You know, you're just having a swing.
Works, by the
and
way.
it's not how it works, but it's how people treat it, because I have family with that, and it's even worse if because I had friends with schizophrenia. One of the things that one of the speakers, actually it was Allison, asked everybody to at ICMI, asked everyone who had experience with male suicide in their lives. I had a college friend who committed suicide, and he was schizophrenic. His parents were of a religion that eschewed medical treatment, and they took away his medication. But they were still, family and friends, people who knew him and knew he was schizophrenic, were still, they didn't hesitate to attribute his experiences, his real life experiences, and his responses to them, to the illness, whenever they disagreed. And that was something that is, I've always wondered if that was part of the reason. I mean, losing his medication meant losing his mind, and that is the primary thing I blame.
Yeah, but I have to say, as somebody, I can't speak for everyone, and knowing what I know about neuropsychology, for some disorders, not for all. For some people, it's not all chemical. For some people, depression is a more physiological or psychological thing, in terms of, like, oh, I don't have any friends or something like that, which is in no way lesser. Okay,
right.
It is still a very, very horrible thing to feel that kind of depression,
and it can change your chemistry.
It absolutely can change your chemistry. That's the terrifying thing. It's just as with any other type of psychological disorder, though, is that if your brain chemistry changes, it means that the way that your mind, which is an organ in your body, is producing chemicals, can actually alter itself. And that's where it becomes scary, because it means for someone like me, I'm medicated, I'm okay at this point. But, like, for people who aren't, it becomes very, very difficult to manage that, because how can you know what is normal at some point when you've been outside of normal for so long? Yeah. And I understand what that's like. How do you know what is normal anymore? And that's scary. It's terrifying, right? What is normal?
Well, and I think we could do a whole show on the topic.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. And talking about the father thing is
mental health conditions and the difference in how society handles them when men experience them. And this is something else. Because he was male, people took his schizophrenia as a indication that he was dangerous.
Yes,
this was probably the most, out of all the guys that I knew on that campus, there were 2 guys that were extremely gentle. One of them was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the other one was just very quiet. And it just was galling that people would, oh, you're schizophrenic, you're dangerous. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. So, yes. I mean, that thing of putting people in boxes.
We get this all the time.
Right.
Real quick, I think we should probably...
Well, we're going to wrap up on this particular topic, but you say one more thing, and then I'm going to go on to Frenchinator.
My real quick final up, or my end on this, is that my uncle, who I looked up to a lot as a kid, I mean, like, I would walk downstairs as a kid every day, and he'd let me watch, South Park with him or whatever. And back in the day, before I was allowed to do that kind of stuff, he had bipolar and was a male and was very much not allowed to express. He was a Vietnam War veteran and was not really allowed in public to express the very extreme, horrible things that he felt as part of being a vet, even through the VFW, particularly through the VFW, I would say. He was not allowed to express himself. And yeah, it was terrible for him. He expressed a lot of his emotions through me, maybe more than anybody. And I miss him. He was I love my uncle. He was great. But he's a great guy. Fantastic man. But, he did not get the kind of medical attention he needed for his mental issues there. And I think that not only was that the case in 1998, that has been so exacerbated in the 20 years, since then, that no one would ever give a shit about my uncle nowadays. And, any young men going through the military system now, there's no way they would get anything.
That's another boxes issue right there. And being bipolar, he's not allowed to also have PTSD, right?
He got, okay.
So
what I mean is in Vietnam,
socially, and he's not allowed to also have PTSD.
He's dead. He's been dead for 20 years almost now. Yeah. Great, amazing guy, but yeah, he killed his dog one day, something like that. Just woke up, walked outside, and strangled his dog to death. That happens to people who get manic. They do crazy, insane shit. Your brain sometimes just is not working. It's not firing on the right cylinders, So despite the fact that you are the nicest, best person in the universe, sometimes your brain will just do something that makes no sense. And I never saw that happen. I only heard about that he killed his dog. But that's the kind of shit that would happen to my uncle. And yeah, man, just saying. It's fucked.
I mean, it's the situation is one of those where it's different from person to person.
Yeah.
And how it manifests in it's one of the problems we have. And I think Anna talked about this before, is the generalization issue in society, that it's easier to deal with generalities than it is to deal with individuals. But I'm going to go on. Frenchinator 2 gave us US $5. As I started to read before and said, I have been diagnosed with ADHD, inactivity, and Asperger's syndrome. The Asperger's was, I just meet enough of the symptoms. I'm right on the edge. And then he gave us $2 more and says, I'm on 40 milligrams Strattera and 10 milligrams Lexapro. It works. And I just want to point out, this was voluntarily given in a super chat, so everybody's already seen it, so it's not a disclosure of private medical information by a public source. It's the individual publicly disclosing anonymously the medical information. It's an important distinction because of HIPAA laws. But in any case, this is something that, like, each individual is going to have different results from different medications. I had results from certain medications. I had positive and negative results from my medications. In addition to the theophylline that I talked about, they put me on selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Helped with the depression, caused insomnia to a dangerous degree. I was actually awake for several days in a row before my roommate called my family and said, "This is happening." They didn't know what was going on because I would fake sleeping. And then they started seeing symptoms of sleep deprivation when I started hallucinating. I got to the point of hallucination. I fooled everybody and got to the point of hallucination.
Holy shit.
So I was like
my God.
in the real danger zone there. And they took me off all of my medications. And I had my doctor had to kind of treat the situation remotely, and they did. And then they re-examined, well, what have we got this person dealing with? And they added another medication and to the list and everything. So, like, different drugs are going to work differently for different people, and it doesn't mean that the side effect problem doesn't exist or the boxing issue doesn't exist, but it does mean that you can, when you get the right combination of medications, when you have a chemical issue, it can be very helpful. So it's good to hear in Frenchinator's situation that has happened.
Yeah, that actually is good. Finding a cure, which is the great thing for me. Yeah. Finding a thing that works is the best you can have. I just have to say, you find the thing, that's the best you got.
I'm going to answer a question that's not a super chat. Jeremy M. asks, what about St. John's wort? Does that work? So there's good and bad in this. Don't use any remedy like that without consulting a doctor. Yes. And I'm going to point out St. John's wort versus prescription drugs is like the difference between aspirin versus narcotics or
Tylenol
even
3.
marijuana. Even the level of Tylenol 3. But there's a variety of levels of medication for pain. And if your pain is at the narcotic level, you could take a whole bottle of aspirin, and the only thing that it's going to do is probably cause you to bleed to death the next time you get a cut. It might damage your heart,
your liver.
All right, and your liver, but it's not going to stop the pain because there's a limit to its effectiveness. And and it would damage your kidneys too. And it would dangerously thin your blood, but you wouldn't get. And the same thing is going to be true with things like St. John's wort. It might be effective for very mild anxiety and very mild depression, because it does, I think it has been, there's been research showing that it has some serotonin reuptake effect. But
yeah, it's a mild antidepressant.
Yeah. But if you are suffering from a severe problem, it's going to be like taking an aspirin for a broken leg. So you still, if you're dealing with that kind of an issue, talk to a professional. Don't just go into a health food store and buy St. John's wort and, think you're going to use it like that.
Well, there's also varying amounts of dosages that different sites sell, so you have to really do research only on the chemical itself, and I would recommend Linus Pauling Micronutrient Center for the information as the greatest aggregate with the most up-to-date research. But on top of that, you have to also do your research when you're buying it from different stores online or what have you, because of the
different brands,
dosage differences and things like that.
Yeah, well, and I noticed also that with herbal supplements, some companies are really good about knowing what it is from the plant that actually is effective, and some companies are total shit about that. And if it's the root of a plant that has the medicinal value, and they sell you a tincture or concoction made from the leaves, then you're not getting what you need, and vice versa.
I would say this though, ladies, we're gonna sell some brain force. We have to sell like the Alex Jones equivalent of what does he do? What does he call it? It's like masculine power. We have to do like the equivalent of that. Feminine force. Ugh, that sounds awful. I just want to die. Ugh.
You really have to be careful with over-the-counter, especially supplements that are not specifically pharmaceuticals, because there's not as much, consistent availability of information. You really have to do your research. And you do have to do your research with drugs as well. It's very dangerous to just trust and take things. Always always do your research.
Absolutely.
And always consult, not just with a doctor, but with a pharmacist. Because you'll find out your pharmacist knows things and pays attention to things that your doctor doesn't, or isn't paid to, or just doesn't have the information, and vice versa. So always be real careful, do your research, and then talk to the professionals as well. And that's with everything, not just like if you're having a long-term issue with sinus, don't just keep taking over-the-counter sinus medicine. Go see your doctor. Same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, and a couple of points on that. Take more vitamin C, take more B vitamins, and drink local honey or eat local honey.
Definitely.
Well, yeah, eat good food too. But in any case,
food, yeah.
these are all things like they can all have an effect on that. But don't just trust that because you see something in a health food store that it's good. Like that's a thing you really got to look into. Going on, Mr. Roboto gave us US $2 and said everyone knows only adult females get to be children. And sadly, as much as I want to say true. That's not true, it's true.
That's hilarious.
Men do not get away with that. Women shouldn't.
Yeah, it's pretty disgusting how women essentially are allowed to get away with acting like children.
And it's damaging, to all of society, but it's also, individually, it's damaging to the woman as well. Your life path is wrecked when you don't have accountability. It prevents you, or rather, it facilitates you in wrecking your own life path and in failing to do the things that you need to do to thrive in your life. And that's really unfair. It's unfair to men because men have to deal with the fallout. It's unfair to children because that means children don't get the benefit of 2 adult parents. It's unfair to the rest of society because the rest of society doesn't get the benefit of a functional adult participant who contributes to the mechanisms and the basically the wealth of society. But it's also unfair to the individual because the individual doesn't get to achieve the greatness that she's capable of. And that's so it's unfair all around. And it would be better. There's not really a downside to applying adult accountability to women in terms of a genuine downside. There are things that we might not enjoy at the time that we have to deal with them, but in the long run, there really isn't a downside to female accountability. There's a massive downside to a lack of female accountability, and we're watching it destroy our society right now, and fighting tooth and nail to put the brakes on, and again, turn this car around. So I'm going to go on to Joey Jojo. And Joey Jojo gave us $10 and said, I didn't have a dad. I was raised by my mother and sister. I hate being a male. I hate my masculinity. I wish I was a woman. After seeing my brother raise his son, I wish I had a father. And the last bit of that is probably the most functional thing he said.
Yes.
I think Joey rage quit earlier in the chat. So he's not going to get to hear this. But the hardest part of this is we hear all the time the phrase toxic masculinity. And there is no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's toxic behavior, and there are toxic attitudes toward the genders. But
and
it doesn't
there's
make
toxic attitudes that manifest in women more likely than manifest in men.
But one's gender identity itself is not toxic.
No.
But what Joey is experiencing there is a function of those toxic attitudes towards men and women, and the toxic dysfunction that is tolerated in women, and that is tolerated when men and boys are the victims of it. Anna, you were going to continue on.
Oh, no, I just, essentially it's just the fact that it's kind of like, we talked about stereotypes and issues with racism and things like that. And like some people have issues with Islam and they tend to lump the entire group of people, or they have issues with feminism and they think it's all women, or they tend to lump the entire group in with the bad few, but then how do you reconcile the fact that there are individuals who are different with the fact that stereotypes exist for a reason and they do end up being true frequently? There are certain types of people that commit certain types of acts, and so how do you reconcile all that? Well, ultimately it's all about culture. It's not about race, it's not about color, it's about culture. What kind of culture are you raised in? So that's sort of by extension that goes to the toxic femininity and toxic masculinity. Yes, it is not assigned to your gender. However, there are toxic expressions that are baked in with the gender, sort of the flip side, the dark side of the benefits that each gender gets. And the more our culture, or whatever culture that is around, these people are around, the more we stoke the fires of the light side versus the dark side, the more that's going to come out. And so, yeah, I don't think it's in any way directly, it's not directly tied to the gender, but it is an expression, a toxic expression of that gender because of which wolf do you feed? Do you feed the good wolf or the bad wolf?
Yeah. Then we have Mr. Roboto gave us US $2, and in response to the question of why the prejudice we were talking about at the time was so easily encouraged, he says because females carry the babies mostly, and that's gynocentrism in a nutshell. He's got a good point there. The DCV Titan gave us $10 Canadian and said, "Here, have some shekels for the good kind reference." Tyler Preston gave us US $5 and said, "When has feminism ever held individual women responsible for anything in their lives? Are they all mentally spoiled children?" We could do an entire show on that. We've done a little bit of a discussion on that. But I think feminism has a range of individuals and attitudes in it, from the clueless to the overtly malicious. And I don't discount the maliciousness because of the fact that the information that counters their narrative has been around for decades, and they've had plenty of time to apprise themselves of the information, and they don't. They in fact strive to hide the information. So there's a degree to which, even with the psychological impact, I mean, it's malicious. That's malicious. So yeah, some of them are mentally spoiled children. Some of them are really, really ignorant, and some of them are malicious. Some of them, the ones that are really, really ignorant, some of them very much care about society and are just taking a very misinformed approach, or very misinformed approach. But there's maliciousness too.
And letting it out on, and they're finding something to let their pain out on.
Yeah.
Just like there are people who are misogynistic, which I don't believe is necessarily a bad thing, because having fear or distrust of something based on experience is a natural human thing to do.
Yep.
So
Exactly. Yeah.
You know.
And then our last one is, and this one just came through a few minutes ago. We have Big JXXX, who I think is a new listener, because I haven't seen that name in chat before. Gave us US $5 and said, "Just got here. Where are you getting your info from? Links, please. Thank you." And I will say, repeat this because this is something we mentioned earlier in the stream, but if you just got here, you wouldn't have gotten to hear it. In the low bar of this stream is a link to the transcript of the opening video, and at the end of that transcript, after the text of the transcript itself, is a link to the studies and stuff the articles and studies that we have been discussing tonight. So that will be the place to look for that information. And I will point out that the first few links you will see are two compilations of information with citations of the various studies that those came from. I don't think all of those are going to be available online, and many of those that are will probably be behind paywalls, but that should give you plenty to read.
Just to be clear, go to sci-hub. I'm telling you right now, you can blame this on me. It is not on you guys. There are very easy ways to obtain these, even without going through the paywall. So, sci-hub.io is a way to obtain it. Generally speaking, however, there are also plenty of paywalls that you can go through as well that will allow you to pay $10, $15 to access all of these studies. Even after I lost access to my university, I have not lost any ability to do my research. So,
Awesome.
Just saying.
All right. Well, thanks for that information.
Yeah.
So there's another source. Again, we've gotten one more, and this is going to be the last one. If you super chat after this, I'm not going to be able to read it. I have to start the after show because I have to leave for work at 11. So, Hoki Bukisa gave us US $10 and said, unfortunately, all of the man-hating has developed a lovely culture of resentment within me that is really toxic. Heh. And I know it's not good, but WTF am I supposed to do about it? That's something that I think we need to do a show on as well, because this is, I feel you there, especially when I am reading about and researching the gender disparities in criminal court, and I go into the gender disparities in criminal court, criminal juvenile court, and the gender disparity in juvenile detention, and the whole bit of information around that. So I mean, one of the things that I have to do in order to deal with that information, I have two specific things that are sort of prevalent or prominent in my means of dealing with these things. One of them is I don't make it a consistent and constant focus. This is really hard too, because when you when you run into that kind of information, it's urgent, but at the same time, it's been urgent for 50 years, and so you're not going to solve it in 5 minutes. And men's issues in general have been urgent for hundreds of years, and we're not going to solve those in 5 minutes. So you have to be able to focus on some things that don't have anything to do with this, that are uplifting, or that are stress relieving. And, you know, like, I look at kitten videos in between doing research on things that's hard to research. Not because I can just forget what I was looking at a minute ago, but because something like that helps to trigger the release of chemicals in the brain that makes it easier to handle the fact that that information is true. Even though it doesn't make the information better, it doesn't make it less upsetting, it makes being upset easier to deal with. I don't know if that helps, but the other thing that I do is I focus on, how do I solve this problem? What can I do to contribute to the solution to this problem? You know, I can share the information, I can contact my representatives, you know, I can help encourage other people to contact their representatives and so on. These are things that I know has probably been referred to repeatedly as a masculine approach. Like, women go to therapy, men go fishing. My response is to go fishing. So I guess I'm atypical.
Well, by meditation, I mean anytime you do a repetitive task with your hands, like washing dishes or gardening or, I don't know, folding panties at Victoria's Secret, whatever it is you do, your mind has time to rest and think about things on a deeper level, which is what I call is the essence of meditation anyway.
Actually, I do that too. I will obsessively clean things when I'm really stressed out.
Yep, because your brain needs time to think on a subconscious level or just barely under conscious level, where you can't quite, you can train, of course, yourself to look deeper and deeper into your subconscious and trace your thoughts and think about your thoughts, figure out why you're having them and what they mean. But for starters, it's really nice to give your brain some time off from active, in your head, aware of it thinking, to have this more subconscious processing of information and menial tasks, fishing, any kind of driving, any kind of quiet time where your body's doing something is ideal for that.
I'm going to point out one other thing, because Hoki Bukisa has updated. I do that too, but the resentment stays there on a hair's trigger. I got a story. I'm going to make this as fast as I can. So it's going to be abbreviated, and that's going to make it sound less personable. But when I was in high school, I ran cross country, and on my team was, this is in an area that's mostly rural, and you run into ignorant people in rural areas that are of a different degree of ignorance than you run into in urban areas. Okay, so on my team was one black girl. All the rest of the girls on the team were white. And so people who were prejudiced, which were rare even, even though you hear that the 80s was this horrible time of great prejudice, no, they were rare. But people who were prejudiced would have this idiotic idea that they could say nasty things to her in front of us and we wouldn't notice or care because we weren't also black. And we'd get mad because this was our friend and our teammate and someone we cared about and someone we were emotionally invested in, the same way you're emotionally invested in family. When you're on a team like that, the people on your team are like a family. And so this was somebody picking on our family member. And it's bad enough that they're doing it to be mean, but they're doing it to be mean in ignorance and stupidity, and they expect us to go along with it. You build up, there's a resentment there that I don't know how to explain it other than you want to spit acid on this person for behaving that way towards your friend and your family member, okay? And we'd get mad, and she would say, we're not going to confront. We're going to beat him on the field. We're going to beat him on the it was not the field, but it's essentially the thing. When you win the race, and she was a hell of a runner, when you win the race, and the idiot has to sit there and watch you get the prize, it's a better feeling than anything you could say back to them. And I kind of feel the same way about these issues. I get mad at people who are shitty toward men for the sake of being shitty because they are men. It's stupid, it's ignorant, it's the same kind of stupid ignorance that you see with people who are shitty towards minorities or white people or any other group for the sake of being that way towards someone in that group. And there's that same experience. Humanity is a team in and of itself. And we're not doing so good at unity right now. But there's this ridiculous expectation from sexist women that all other women are going to hate men. And they do the same thing. And I have that same attitude. And it's the same with when I have that resentment on a hair trigger over, society is alright with throwing away children who have dysfunctional responses to the world around them that lands them in trouble in court, in trouble with the law. That we're okay with throwing away the ones that are boys as a society. And there's a resentment that grows that's very similar to that old resentment, and I want the same thing. The people that are perpetuating this, the people that are okay with this, I want to beat them on the field. I want to see this change happen that stops that. And that's going to be better than anything I could do to those people. It would be better than punching their face in. It would be better than having the perfect thing to say to them to leave them feeling an inch tall. It would be better than anything I could do. Better than any settlement, better than anything. To beat them on the field. And so that's my response.
Yeah, essentially, it's a mix of don't argue with an idiot, they'll drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. And equal parts that, and the fact that, don't be what feminists expect you to be. There's a perverse pleasure you can get out of killing them with kindness.
Yep.
And also, on top of that, if you have to examine your motivations. Do you truly want to let go of that anger, or is it feeding something in you that maybe not so healthy, then you're allowing it to stay? Do you truly want to get rid of it, or is it just something that is a handy excuse? Just because there's legitimate reasons to be resentful, are you actually resentful for the right reason, or are you just using it as an outlet for your anger? Yeah. And if you are, then if you do truly want to change and improve your life and get rid of that poison, as we say, where resentment is like swallowing poison and expecting the other person to die. It is something you're doing for yourself. So you can do yourself. So you can forgive them, not for them, for yourself, just so that you are not burdened with their shitty minds and their shitty expectations. And you can look at them simply as children. And that gives such a release and such a peace of mind and a certain type of forgiveness. They're animals. Forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. They are running into each other. They're, messed up. And it really helps to see anger as having pain at its source. It could be pain of being lazy, selfish, spoiled little princesses that a lot of times some feminist types end up being. But that also means that they're dysfunctional. They cannot actively function in society. So they use feminism or what have you as a way to get rid of that pain. So you can see them as creatures or children or some force that is outside of you that you can't really do much about other than just let go, forgive, and then beat them on the playing field.
Exactly. And with that, the only other thing I'm gonna say on this is, we've talked about we're in a culture war, but we're not in a culture war against an opposing side in humanity. We are in a culture war against the de-evolution of society, which is what we're seeing happen right now. And it's the other people are not our enemies. The bad ideas and their impact on society are our enemies, and that's what we need to fight against. So we can be angry, and it's easy to get angry at stupidity. But in the end, the best focus is, use your anger, use your response to this to fuel your fight. Let it make you work harder. Let it make you more effective. And that's basically the best I can do. That's the best approach to this type of situation. But with that, I'm going to thank everybody.
Just real quick, speaking of fueling the fight, I want to let people know that all the super chats and all of that wonderful stuff that goes directly to Honey Badger Radio, I am here as a volunteer, so you can support me on my Patreon to help me take more time out to be on more HBR shows. And if you miss Cherry Stem, that is also on my Patreon and my YouTube channel, so check out patreon.com/Anna Cherry. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, and Aydin also shall. I almost forgot about that. Are you there, Aydin?
Yes, I am,
Okay.
but I'm really tired.
Okay, I was going to ask if you also had something to shell.
No, not really.
Okay. Well then, in that case, I will. We'll go ahead and end the stream. So I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank both of my co-hosts for sticking it out, because this was a long one. And also everybody behind the scenes who makes Honey Badger Radio happen. Thank you all, and good night.